So they have to look at the regulation, they look at the general plan, and they look at like what the zoning is. And the zoning on the property is resort, and when, you know, Mr. Head had asked me like, what are my thoughts? I said like, well, probably it's resort, so some sort of resort things. But I think you should look at some lower density activity. And lower density, try to keep it like at a residential level scale. And that's the reason why, and to their credit, they accepted my recommendation to go with a residential scale. The residential scale for the lowest for single-family residential is RS 7.5. If you look at all in the resort zone, and this is the zoning map for the Waikoloa area, you see like V 1.25. V 1.25 suggests 1 unit for every 1,250 square feet. If you look at the other one, RM 1.5, RM 6, they all suggest 1 unit over 1,500 square feet, 1 unit for every 6,000 square feet. So in relation to the overall Waikoloa resort area, from a resort standpoint or residential standpoint, this would be the lowest zoning density, V 7.5. Then they had to look at like the archaeological considerations, and this kind of like led to the delay, and perhaps I take some fault in that, but they had like an already SHPD, State Historic Preservation Division, approved archaeological inventory service. So what I have there is like a letter that's dated October 23, 1996, and basically saying that they approved the site, approved the plan on this, approved the archaeological preservation program for this plan. They said had only four things, which were like 2 petroglyphs, and which were pointed out by Maya, Miss Jackson, and there were also 2 ancholine ponds. If anything, those will be the 4 things that require preservation. And then on May 16, 2001, they approved the preservation plan. Along those lines. The staff also kind of pointed out, that other sheet I had, like from Anaeho'omalu. And Anaeho'omalu, back in October 30, 2000, basically said, and I highlighted for you, State Historic Preservation Division has not recommended a trail for preservation because the sites are similar, are preserved elsewhere in the resort area. So, we kind of like started, like on some of these parameters, and, on hindsight, like they were antiquated, but nevertheless, we used these as kind of like initial benchmark to start the planning process. But in the meantime, we knew that what those studies did not indicate like any cultural assessment. With the recent decision that was made by the Supreme Court relating to the Kapa'akai decision, you had to address, decision makers need to address the cultural resources on the property and not necessarily only the physical archaeological things. And so before they started on the program, then they say, okay, let's do a cultural impact assessment. So that's what's found in item number 3. A cultural impact assessment was done by Alan Hahn in 2015. I'm just taking you to chronological, from chronologically. And then in summary, what the impact assessment showed was that in Dr. Hahn's discussion with some of the people who have some interest in that area, they found that the trails were important. So, we had to take that into consideration. Then the other thing we had to look at, way back when, we need to figure out like, what's the relevance of, what's the importance of the marine life in that area, the ancholine pond. And then is the project going to have any adverse impact, to the marine life in that area? So they had commissioned 3 different professionals to specifically evaluate that. 2 of them are here today, and they'll be able to more in detail answer your questions. The first consultant was this guy named Dr. Tom Nance, and his job was essentially to look at the hydrology on the property, seeing that if you're going to have a drainage system, if you have normal rainfall, people just kind of like do the landscaping and all that, what permeates, what goes through the ground and what eventually comes down to the shoreline. So he did that kind of assessment. Then you had somebody like Dr. Steve Dalla, who is here today. He looks at that information and then he says, like, based on that, this is the impact, to the coastal line, to the sea turtles or other marine life in that particular area. Concurrently, based on the evaluation by, the analysis by Dr. Tom Nance, we had Dr. Richard Brock. Richard Brock is a specialist dealing with alkaline pond, and he's here today. So you can ask him the specific questions about whether the project would have any adverse impact on the alkaline ponds themselves. So item number 4 just basically talks about, that's Dr. Brock's report, and he can speak to you directly on that issue. But I think what's really important, in Dr. Brock's study, I say that because I'm leading up to something eventually. He talks about like the management zones, the alkaline pool buffer, around them. And what he had recommended way back when, I mean in 2015, was that the width of the buffer zone should be 5 feet. But we all know by looking at that map already, it's no longer 5 feet. It's considerably more than that. And I'll give you more detail in terms of what ultimately is going to be proposed. On page 5, item number 5. Item number 5 is the first site plan that was submitted, and which you don't have it, but I needed to kind of just share because that application was subsequently not withdrawn, or modified to where we are today. But I think that just so that the commission will have some idea as far as like how we came to where we are today. That site plan, if you see, first of all, it shows only a 40-foot shoreline setback. And then it shows like, on the trails, what you see over there is the map that's currently the pending application. But in that area, you can, remember where the fingers of the trail were coming down? You can see that those trails like now have been preserved. If you look at the plan that was initially prepared back in 2015, none of them, like just a small little narrow buffer of those trails were preserved. So it's kind of like really morphed into something more than what was initially submitted back in 2015. And you can also see, right on the Mauka side of the alkaline pond, a series of structures. This is back in the 2015 plan. Now you look at the 2017 plan, which was submitted, there are no structures between the pond and the parking lot. So the point being that over time and through a lot of interaction with the staff, we've had, and the County Cultural Commission, we've had to modify the plans to reflect, to come to where we are today. Item number 6, basically, I'll just kind of like summarize, just talks essentially about the, just make it easier for the commission to find it, because in 700 pages you won't have difficulty finding it. But over there is basically talking about the County Cultural Commission. And until going through this process, I didn't really realize the value of that County Cultural Commission. But we appeared before them 3 times, and during all of the times, constructive criticism was given on the updated archaeological inventory survey as well as the preservation plan. They made some excellent recommendations, and based on those recommendations, the Dr. Anaeho'omalu, who's also here, and he'll testify and answer your questions, he made some modifications, and only with the modifications or combinations of the comments made by the the County Cultural Commission, then the plan was submitted and SHPD finally approved it. The SHPD approved it back in 2017. They approved the inventory survey and they approved the preservation plan as well. The figure in number 7 is something that's already there, and I've kind of like covered it, but item number 8 is basically a letter from SHPD, which is kind of buried in your 700-page document, but it's November 7, 2017, and SHPD in that letter basically said that they approved both documents, the archaeological impact survey, archaeological inventory survey, and the preservation plan. But there's one section that I'd like to kind of read to you largely for emphasis, because you're probably going to hear comments about like the developer is not responsible or not taking into accommodation the archaeological features on the property. But this is what SHPD says, like on page 2 of their letter, and I've kind of highlighted it for you. The conceptual plan incorporates the agreed upon preservation measures between the landowner, SHPD, and the Hawaii County Cultural Resources Commission. Preservation measures include the site-specific boundaries and buffers, construction barriers, restoration and renaturalization, maintenance of the trail system, coastal sand replenishment, and a beach stabilization plan. The coastal sand replenishment and the beach stabilization plan, they were needed because that's where the one of the 2 petroglyphs are. They're right by the ocean, and they're going to be eroded or lost, and so they had to come up with some program to see how we're going to save that petroglyph. So those were all agreed upon, and with that understanding, then SHPD went through. You see page 3 of that same letter. SHPD basically says that they want to see archaeological monitoring. They want an archaeological monitoring plan. Well, the monitoring plan, archaeological monitoring plan has already been there. And most critically, they wanted to see a plat map showing where the archaeological preserves, which include the trails, where they are. They wanted to have it mapped out by meets and bounds survey. And that leads up to the destruction and the discovery of the desecration of the trail. Then on, item number 9, you see the, like you'll hear and read the comments that come up, relating to this project. And when I've read through almost all of those, the comments, they seem to have like a common thread. The thread being like, what's the impact to the ancholine ponds? What's the impact on public parking? What's the impact on coastal access, the marine life, and resources such as the green sea turtle? And what about the archaeological cultural resources? So from that standpoint on the ancholine pond, that's the item 9. The Fish and Wildlife Service is the one entity, like how we rely on SHPD on archaeological land. From the Fish and Wildlife Service, there's a lot of reliance on what, they have the technical knowledge. And so we rely on whatever they have to say, in addition to our own consultant, and in this case here, Dr. Brock and Dr. Steve Dollar. But the Fish and Wildlife Service, specifically as it relates to the ancholine pond and the damselflies, is like, the plan that you guys had prepared by Dr. Brock, that's the best you can do. And that's their statement on page 8, and I kind of highlighted it for you. It says, in addition to measures listed below, all of which the applicant has agreed to accept, it said, we strongly recommend that you implement the management plan prepared, in Exhibit B, Exhibit Delta rather. That's the plan prepared by Dr. Richard Brock. And it goes on to say the Fish and Wildlife Service supports SHPD's recommendation to monitor the 2 ancholine ponds and the ephemeral pond, and that's going to happen. I'd like to also kind of, the staff pointed out to that email that's also found in that same section towards the end, from Eldred Nalboa, with the Fish and Wildlife Service. He went on the field inspection, and I accompanied them, and I learned a lot from that inspection as well. But his recommendation was to say that on the large ancholine pond, for example, not the 5-foot buffer that Dr. Brock had recommended in his management plan, but a 40-foot buffer. But that's already accommodated, as you can see. The 40-foot buffer is like, you see the big pond, and there's no dwellings between that pond and the proposed parking lot area. And they talk about placing signage. Sure, that's all going to happen. So in addition to whatever was written in the Fish and Wildlife Services letter, these additional recommendations by Fish and Wildlife staff, the owner has said, the applicant has said, will accept. There was also the other issue about, the green sea turtle. And again, please feel free to ask the question of Dr. Dollar, and Dr. Brock, those kind of questions, because they'll be here to testify as well. But on the issue of the green sea turtle, again, the Fish and Wildlife Service. They're kind of like, I would consider the agency guru, you know, on this kind of area as well. And if you look at page 6 of their letter, which I've enclosed, it specifically talks about green sea turtles. You know, this is like on item number 10, and then the second page of that letter from Fish and Wildlife Service. And basically it says on the green sea turtle, the Fish and Wildlife Service, they consults on sea turtles, and then they go on to suggest what needs to be done, you know, to minimize the impact. And I think Ms. Jackson had read some of their mitigations, and, you know, in terms of how you address the green sea turtle issue. And all of those recommended mitigation suggested by the Fish and Wildlife Service is acceptable to the applicant. And should the commission in its wisdom decide to approve the SMA permit and make that as a condition, it's not going to come with any objection on the part of the applicant. On item number 11, you know, really deals like with the lateral coastal access. You know, the staff talked about, like, you know, there have been some concerns about, like, you know, whether there's some restriction in terms of lateral movement along the shoreline. To our knowledge, there has not been any restriction on lateral movement in that area. They've had signs prepared in the past, and the signs were redone largely because the signs that were initially placed gave the public a misconception in terms of where you can and where is the public access and where is not. So the signs were replaced with the photos that I show you over here. And these photos are the county-approved public access sign. And they're placed at a location where it becomes unmistakable in terms of where the public's right to traverse laterally along the shoreline, you know, can and should occur. In the area of the public parking, which is item number 12, we realize that, you know, there are times like, you know, like Lava, you know, when they're because it's a very successful operation. There have been situations where when they do fundraising, whether it's for the Kona Hospital Foundation or other kind of fundraising, they're going to have large gatherings in that area. And then at those point in time, they don't have enough parking. It's like any other situation. They've met the zoning code requirement. We meet our zoning code requirement when we construct our single-family dwelling and you put up 2 cars. And then that's all the code requires. But how often have we had, you know, we've had situations where you've had parties and then no enough parking stalls. You know, so they park on the street and they park wherever. And then that's the same situation. You satisfy the minimum requirement for parking. But on the other hand, there are going to be situations where additional parking is required. But so at any rate, like one of the things that was causing a lot of heartburn, you know, on this parking issue was that having these special events. The planning department was rightfully so, said that that's not allowed. And so the applicant as landowner basically told Lava, its tenant, to say, you got to stop that. You got to comply with the county's requirement. So it stopped, it ceased. That, however, doesn't take away the fact that sometimes the restaurant is going to be busy and then you're going to have like a turnover. It's like the golf course. You know, like you have like one, you know, four stall. The stall requirement for golf course is like 4 stalls for every hole. But then, so that might be enough. But when you have the turnover, the first guys begin tee off at 7:30 and the next guys come in at 11:30. But what happens if at 10 o'clock or 10:30 they come and you're not going to have enough stall? It happens at the Hilo Municipal quite often. But what I've shown that on page 12 is like the number of stalls in that area. You know, it just shows you, you know, you have like about 65 or 70 stalls in that area. But that property which is situated immediately mark of the, you know, the property that you're now being, you know, under consideration right now, is owned by the applicant. They created that parking stall, the parking area. It's a 5-acre site. Now that 5-acre site today, if you look at the last page that I had included, it's a schematic. It's a schematic that shows that it can easily be expanded to up to like about 124 stalls in all of the already improved areas, so they don't have to do more grading and all that stuff. But if you look at this, it's kind of clear that you can have additional parking. And the applicant is willing to have this additional parking to accommodate for these overflow, at time overflow need. So double the amount of parking. They don't visit the entire 10-acre site every day or whatever, and neither does the archaeologist go visit the site. But what happened was that in the preservation plan, and as recommended by SHPD and the County Cultural Commission, they said that, you know what, you guys should, as soon as possible, do a meets and bounds survey of all of the sites that are going to be preserved, which are not only the petroglyph sites, but all of those trails. So it was when the surveyor, now this is like before getting any approvals. So they were just going to do that anyway. So then they hired the surveyors. The surveyors go out and they say like, what happened to this segment of the trail? It was destroyed. They didn't do it, but they don't know how. Somebody did it. So all they did in a responsible way, they contacted the state, they contacted the police department, because it's like an unlawful entry, and destruction of their property. So it's under investigation right now. But nonetheless, in the mode of also being proactive, what's done is done. So the question is like, how do you restore it? So then they hired Dr. Han, and he's here again, and you can ask him the question. So he prepared like what's included in that item number 13. It talks about a trail reconstruction plan. And basically that, it talks about like they would try as best as they can to renaturalize the trail and to make a nice transition. But to begin with, the renaturalization of the trail was part of the overall preservation plan efforts. So it's not independent. So eventually they can kind of duplicate a situation, but it's not going to be like how it was like before the destruction, but it'll have the appearance of being almost like how it was before. So finally, it kind of like gets to like where we are right now, and based on all of the comments that we've heard, from agencies, from discussions with the planning staff, reviewed the public comments to date, the applicant has made further modification to the plan, which is reflected on item number 14, and that. Can you just show it now?
Absolutely. Show the public.
Yeah. And I think if you look at that plan and you compare with that, because that's kind of like what is the current application right now. So what I'd like to direct you to is like, if you look at the Mauka southern corner, where the trails are, you could see where the swimming pool and there was like a lawn area. The idea right now is that the whole area would all be kept as an open space. So in terms of the buffer where, the Cultural Resources Commission had recommended maybe using Anaeho'omalu's guideline for trail buffer of 15 feet from the edge of the trails, it's no longer 15 feet. It's considerably more than that. It's like one whole swath, this area is being set aside and kept in its natural state.
So that's right here. The area referring to.
The other thing is that, like, from a density standpoint and the height, what they came in with a revision. Again, they said like, okay, rather than doing 44 units, they'd be in a position to just do 40 units. So the plan before you reflects 40 units, and more critically, along the shoreline, on the Mackay section, they're all single-family dwelling. They're not single-family, they're single-story in height. In previous plans, they reflected multiple stories in that area, 2 stories. So as best as, like I can say, like, we've heard a lot of the comments, we've tried to address almost all of them. I know that the director had indicated like there are like a number of issues that he would want to have the commission consider. One was in relation to the density and whether there's going to be enough parking. And I think that in the record, we tried to say like how we can address that the need, the density as it translates to additional parking. They talk about the trails and then the pool being between those trails like that. And we're saying that it's out. We're not going to have any pool, no activity area in that area. It's one natural area. On the Green Sea Turtle, whatever the Fish and Wildlife Service recommendations is advancing, their recommendations are acceptable, to the applicant. In terms of the 10-foot wide lateral access, we've already spoken with the staff, and we say that it would be shifting, depending on where the tide is, from a practical matter, because it changes during the course of a day. And it changes whether you have high tide, low tide, monster tide, or whatever. So we say wherever it is, because the objective is to allow for unfettered lateral access, through the property, along the shoreline. Speaking about access to, also the plan called for, this plan and also the current plan, like I think Ms. Carsmith, you questioned about like why did the trail end? My understanding, and Dr. Hahn can corroborate, was that that's all they could find. It just ended for some reason. And so when we went before the County Cultural Commission, they had said like, okay, if that's what's on the ground, but we know at some point in time it's got to go down to the shoreline. So can you integrate that into your plan? So we said yes, fine. So the that plan, as well as the current plan right now, reflects the extension of the trail down to the shoreline. So anyway, I'm getting hoarse. So, I think I'm done.
It seems that increasing concern for developments that are near the shoreline, particularly larger ones, as a result of the porosity of the soils, is the leaching of chemicals through the porosity of the soil and into the ocean, affecting everything from algae to coral and so forth. On Sidney Fuki's tab 4 from alkaline pool resources, it shows the change in surveys from 2001 to 2015. In particular, phosphorus increased by about 250% and is beyond the standard. And also, this orthophosphorus increased about 60%. So I was just wondering what impact a small property like this, a modest-sized property like this, is going to have. I can't imagine that it's going to be helpful, but I was interested in the sort of the technical conclusion.
It's a very good question, and all I can do is draw on my own personal past experience. There are a bunch of ways of looking at it. One way is to go to some of the areas where there is no development whatsoever. Macalavena, we use that as a control site. I used Coquille before anything was down there for 10 years as a control site. Sampling, doing water sampling and watching nutrients through time. And what I found, like at Coquille, there's 7 parameters that have standards, state standards, that are currently used. And what I found down there is 6 of the 7 standards over a 10-year period were all out of compliance at Coquille. At Macalavena, phosphorus is one. Macalavena, similar sort of thing, 65% of the time that standards were, when I sample, 65% of the time, I had 65% out of compliance over a 15-year period. Okay, so that's one way to look at it. Another way to look at it is to look at what do we see on developed property, pre-development, developed, and going through time. And what we have found, and I'm basing this on more than 20,000 samples collected in West Hawaii, over starting in about 1985, 86. So it's a considerable period of time and effort. And what we find is that the concentrations of nutrients bounce, and there's no rhythm to it that I can tell. So sometimes when you sample, things are high. Other times when you sample, they're low. And what you're referring to there are two little sets of samples based on, what was it, about 6 or 7 samples in the ocean, just right out in front, because they asked me to just take a quick look. 2 times, 15 years apart, or 14 years apart. And one time, the first time, yeah, they're lower. The next time, oh, we went from 2 out of compliance to 4. I think that's it. I mean, you probably have it in front of you. And I can go back tomorrow, and we might have higher non-compliance, it might be lower.
That's fine, thank you very much. I think what you probably summarized is that given the violation in some of these areas, there's kind of a sad state of affairs everywhere. Thank you.
Sir, on that same topic, what changes have you seen occur if you have done any tests on the bigger ponds in front of the Marriott or in front of Colea area? Do you have any sense of how those have changed since the development there at Colea?
They have changed. They've gone, like I said, sometimes things are up, other times things are low. Overall, looking at Waikoloa, which I started sampling 1986, something like that, up to present, overall, over the years, things went high early on because you have golf course grow-in is one thing, and nutrients go through the roof. Does that impact things in Anchorland ponds? At the concentrations that we have measured, and some of them are quite high, no, it has no impact. And I attribute that to the fact that in a lot of undeveloped areas, we get similar, sometimes high results in Anchorland ponds. It just says to me that the things that have evolved in those ponds, the little opaiula shrimp and things like that, are completely insensitive to it. It doesn't make any difference to them. The numbers aren't impacting them. Now, if you're talking pesticides, potentially, yeah, you could have a problem. But we sample for pesticides and we don't find them. So it's a big system. And you got a lot of groundwater moving beneath your feet into the ocean. And there's a lot of variability.
Excuse me. Sir, did you have a comment?
Yes, regarding your comments on phosphorus, I've seen the same kind of thing, and what we sort of have concluded is when you see these huge spikes in phosphorus but not in nitrogen, it's a result of people using the pond because phosphates are high in soaps and detergents. And as Dr. Brock said, it's usually ephemeral, but to repeat what he's saying, that most of these ankling ponds are what we call nutrient limited, meaning that they have very high levels of nutrients in their normal healthy stage. And it's only when you have other things getting involved, like alien fish, that kind of mess up the balance, that you see the degradation.